wine glass in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Across the table, my son Marcus slid a glossy brochure toward me, and my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, smiled the way people smile when they've rehearsed it. "Dad, we found the perfect place for you," she said. I looked at the cover. A care facility called Lakeside Meadows tucked outside Lewiston, Maine. I didn't raise my voice. I folded the brochure in half, set it down, and said only, "I understand." Then I stood, buttoned my coat, and walked out into the December cold without another word. They thought I had finally broken. What they didn't know was that my next move would cost them everything they believed was already theirs. My name is Walter Hensley. For 31 years, I ran port operations in Portland, Maine, the kind of job that teaches you to read a crisis before it becomes one. I retired at 66, and for 4 years, my biggest daily decision was whether to add rosemary to the stew. I was 70 years old, sharp as a tack, and by every measure that mattered, perfectly capable. Then came the dinner invitation. Marcus called on a Friday, his voice oddly formal, like a man reciting lines he hadn't fully memorized. He said Vanessa was making her roast chicken, and they wanted to catch up. I drove the 40 minutes to their house in Falmouth with a bottle of decent red and the foolish hope of seeing my grandchildren, Owen and Clara. The kids were already upstairs when I arrived, tucked away before I'd even taken off my coat. Vanessa greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Walter, you look tired," she said, taking my coat like she was collecting evidence. "Is the house on Ashford Street getting to be too much?" I said nothing. I sat, I ate. We talked about the weather and the price of heating oil, but the real conversation was happening underneath, in the way Marcus kept checking his phone, in the way his knee bounced under the table. After the plates were cleared, he didn't bring dessert. He reached for a folder instead, and set it exactly where his dinner plate had been. "Dad," he said, voice dipping into forced concern, "Vanessa and I have been thinking about your legacy." I looked at that folder and I already knew what was inside without opening it. 90 days of small comments of careful concern had been building toward this exact moment. I placed my hand over his, felt how clammy his skin was, and I said the only thing I had left to say. "I understand." Then I walked out into the New England night. And somewhere behind me I heard the quiet, satisfied click of a door closing on what they thought was a solved problem. The headlights of my sedan cut through the dark stretch of Route 1 like a pair of surgical blades. Usually the drive from Falmouth back to Portland was a peaceful hour of decompression. Tonight the silence in the car felt like it had a pulse. I kept my hand steady at 10 and 2, doing exactly the speed limit, because some part of me suspected they'd be watching for a mistake to add to their file. I had said I understand to end the dinner, to stop the suffocating weight of their staged pity, but as the miles passed beneath the tires, my mind did what 31 years at the port had trained it to do. It began auditing the manifest. A disaster at the docks never starts with an explosion. It starts with small, ignored deviations, a mislabeled container, a sensor someone decided to bypass because they were in a hurry. Tonight, for the first time, I saw the pattern they had been weaving around me for months. It started back in August, when I fumbled a glass reaching for the top shelf and it shattered in the sink. An ordinary accident, the kind anyone could have, but Vanessa hadn't laughed it off. She'd frozen, then whispered, "Your coordination, Walter. It's getting worse, isn't it?" Then there was the parking lot incident 18 months earlier, tapping a curb so gently a snail could have outrun the impact. Vanessa had brought it up no fewer than 7 times since, always in front of company, always with that same tilted head of manufactured worry. It wasn't concern, it was evidence gathering. Marcus had a different role. He was the auditor of my mortality. 2 weeks earlier, he'd sat in my living room and asked, unprompted, whether I'd updated my will lately. I had thought he was being dutiful. Sitting in the dark of that car, the truth hit me with the force of an incoming tide. They weren't worried about my health. They were terrified of my independence, and they were systematically eroding my confidence in my own mind so they could step in as saviors and take the wheel. By the time I reached my driveway on Ashford Street, my heart had slowed to a heavy, deliberate rhythm. I walked upstairs, clicked on the bathroom light, and stared at the man in the mirror. 70 years were etched into that face, but my hands weren't shaking. "Not tonight," I whispered to the empty house. And never. I thought of my lawyer, and I made a silent vow right there in the cold light. They could have my time. They could have my patience. They would never take my freedom. I was still the master of my own harbor. Morning arrived with a bite of frost that tasted like iron and salt off Casco Bay. I stepped onto my back porch with a mug of black coffee and looked down at my garden. The tomato plants, heavy with fruit only a week before, were now black and shriveled, killed overnight by an early frost. In my younger days, I would have cursed the unpredictable Maine weather. Now I felt only a grim familiarity. Nature, like people, has a way of showing you exactly where you stand once the illusion of protection disappears. I let my mind drift back 30 years, to the late 80s when running the Portland. Docks meant facing down 200 furious longshoremen at 3 in the morning. There had been a Union man named Duke Malone, built like a freight elevator, who once cornered me in a warehouse with 4 men behind him. He wanted me to sign off on a manifest that hid contraband worth more than a small island. "Sign it, Hensley," he'd growled. "You've got a wife and a boy at home." I didn't sign. I walked into his space until I could see the broken capillaries in his nose, and I told him exactly what would happen if he ever mentioned my family again. It was a bluff, but I held his gaze until he saw the steel in mine. That night I learned that respect isn't given at a harbor. It's seized and it's defended every single day. Marcus never saw that version of me. He grew up with the retired man who reads history books and worries about the pH of his soil. He saw an old oak and assumed the core had gone soft with rot. He was wrong. I finished my coffee and went into my study, to a room that smelled of old paper and cedar. Behind a false panel in the bookshelf sat a heavy cast-iron floor safe. Marcus assumed held nothing but old tax returns. I knelt, my knees popping, and dialed the combination. Inside was not gold, but something better. A leather-bound ledger of names. Men who'd worked under me and gone on to become port authorities, customs officials, and private investigators. Men who owed me their careers. I flipped to the letter B and found Gerald Boone, a man who had stood beside me the night Duke Malone tried to break my ribs. I picked up the landline, wanting no digital trail, and dialed his number. "Gerald," I said when he answered. "It's Walter. I need a manifest checked. I think it's time we discussed some overdue cargo." The master of the port was back on the clock. The glow of my phone in the pre-dawn dark was a cold, clinical blue. I was sitting at the breakfast nook when it buzzed against the table. A transaction alert from my bank. Transaction denied, $2,500, location, a casino in Bangor. A chill that had nothing to do with the frost crawled up my spine. I hadn't set foot in a casino in a decade. The timestamp read 1:14 a.m., the exact hour I'd been lying awake replaying the ambush at dinner. I knew exactly who had access to my emergency card, the one kept in a porcelain jar in the hallway. I walked into my den to the aging desktop computer Marcus had helped me set up. He assumed I was hopeless with technology, a man stuck in the era of clipboards. He didn't know that running a modern port meant overseeing logistics, systems more complex than any home computer. The browser was still open from his last visit, and he'd stayed logged into a private portal. It wasn't a bank. It was an offshore betting site. I scrolled through months of frantic activity. Basketball games, late-night horse races, digital poker rooms, thousands of dollars moving mostly out. At the bottom of the screen sat an outstanding balance that made my breath catch. $200,000. The pieces locked together with a sickening click. Marcus didn't want me in a care home because he was worried about my safety. He wanted the house on Ashford Street liquidated, because it was his only way out of the hole he'd dug. Vanessa's concern about my reflexes wasn't about my reflexes at all. It was about the private school tuition, the new SUV, the lifestyle sitting on a crumbling financial ledge. They weren't building a case to save me. They were building a coffin for my independence, so they wouldn't have to face the consequences of their own greed. I photographed every transaction, every login, every timestamp, and backed it up to a secure cloud drive. I wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard with a cloth before I left the room. I was no longer just a father being pushed around. I was an investigator documenting a betrayal, and I knew exactly which port to drop the shipment at. The diner smelled the way it always had, of fried onions, diesel exhaust, and dark roast strong enough to jumpstart a heart. I found Gerald Boone in his usual booth, and he pushed a second mug of coffee toward me before I even sat down. "You look like a man whose anchor line just snapped," he said. "It's worse than frayed, Gerald. It's been cut." I told him everything. The folder, the dinner, the $200,000 I'd found on the family computer. He listened in the disciplined silence of a man who'd spent decades keeping order on a chaotic dock. When I finished, he leaned forward. "It's worse than you think, Walter. Marcus came to see me 3 days ago." My stomach dropped. "He brought good scotch and started talking about your episodes. Asked if I'd sign a witness statement for a guardianship hearing." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him if he wasn't out of my house in 10 seconds, I'd show him exactly how much coordination an old longshoreman still has." This was no longer a private family matter. It was a campaign, and Marcus was trying to turn my oldest friends into witnesses against me. "You need someone who speaks his language," Gerald said, sliding a business card across the table. "Margaret Cole. She doesn't just know the law. She knows how to use it like a scalpel." An hour later, I was in the glass-walled office of Margaret Cole, a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and eyes that recorded everything. I laid it all out, the folder, the casino transaction, the photos from the computer. She didn't look shocked. She simply tapped a rhythmic beat against her desk. "Your son is attempting a classic gray zone takeover," she said. "It's not illegal to be concerned, but forgery, unauthorized card use, attempting to suborn witnesses, those are the cracks we'll use to bury him. The house is currently in your name, which makes it a target," she continued. "If he wins a guardianship hearing, he can sell it before you can say objection. We need to lock your life into a vault a court-appointed guardian can't touch." "What do we do first?" I asked. "We build a trust," she said, "an irrevocable one, and we do it while you are demonstrably, medically and legally competent." I stood up, feeling strength return to my legs. "I want to protect the house, Margaret, and I want Marcus to pay the full price for choosing the wrong side of this manifest." Fog rolled in thick over Casco Bay the day Margaret and I began drafting the trust in earnest. Her desk was covered in documents that looked like blueprints for a fortress. "Logistics, Mr. Hensley, is the art of moving something from where it is to where it needs to be without the enemy realizing it's gone," she said, her fountain pen scratching across the parchment. "The house, your accounts, your pension, they're all exposed cargo right now. Marcus sees them on his radar. Once we move everything into the Hensley Family Legacy Trust, you no longer legally own any of it," she explained. "The trust does. Even if he convinces a judge you can't manage your own socks, there will be nothing left for him to manage." But there was a timeline. Deed transfers, bank authorizations, roughly 2 weeks before the vault was fully locked. 2 weeks was a vulnerable window, and I couldn't just sit and wait for the ink to dry. "He's building a medical case against me," I told her, recording every stumble, every forgotten name. "Which is why we strike first," she said. "But I can't be involved in this part. It has to be untainted by legal coaching." I left her office and drove 60 miles in the opposite direction, to a private medical complex in Augusta. With no ties to my local doctor or Marcus's connections, I booked the appointment under a slight variation of my name and paid in cash. I wanted the hardest neuropsychological evaluation they had. For 4 hours, a specialist half my age tested my memory, my reasoning, my ability to track rapidly shifting variables. At one point, he asked me to describe berthing a container ship during a spring tide, and I mapped the entire calculation out on his whiteboard. "Drag windage tug power requirements. You're very precise, Mr. Hensley," he noted. "Precision is the only thing that keeps a harbor from becoming a graveyard," I told him. The results came back on a single sheet with a blue embossed seal. "Cognitive function in the top 5% for your age group. No evidence of decline. Full capacity for self-determination and financial management." I placed that report in my glove compartment right next to Margaret's business card. Marcus thought he was writing the manifest. He'd forgotten the first rule of any harbor. You never assume a vessel is empty just because the lights are out. By the second week, everything was in motion. It was 9 at night in Portland, which meant dinner time in Denver, where my daughter Nora sat in her kitchen, her face a mask of controlled fury that mirrored my own. Nora had always been the navigator of the family, a corporate lawyer with a sharp edge and zero patience for predators, even ones who shared her last name. "I'm booking a flight, Dad," she said. "I'll walk into that house and dismantle Marcus piece by piece." I shook my head. "No, Nora, stay in Denver. Stay quiet." "Quiet? He's trying to steal your life to pay off gambling debts. How can you ask me to be quiet?" "Because the most dangerous movement is the one the radar doesn't pick up," I said. "If you show up shouting, you turn this into a noisy family feud." I don't want a feud. I want a total blockade. I told her about Margaret Cole and the Hensley Family Legacy Trust. About the medical report with its blue embossed seal. For this to be bulletproof, I need a beneficiary who's stable and loyal, I said. I want you as primary beneficiary. Co-trustee Marcus excluded entirely. She went quiet for a moment, blinking back tears. Dad, you don't have to do that. That's exactly why it has to be you. He spent his life looking at my assets as a future payout. Once he realizes there's nothing left to inherit, he'll have to face his own debts. We spent the next hour going through the fine print, her West Coast legal instincts sharpening our Atlantic defense. He's going to keep pushing, she warned. The gaslighting will get worse. Let it, I said. Every time they try to manipulate me, they're just handing Margaret more evidence. I've survived union strikes that would make Marcus's head spin. I can handle some staged confusion. Don't call him, Nora, don't post anything. We need them to believe their plan is working perfectly. I want them so confident they stop being careful. I love you, Dad, she said before we hung up. Stay sharp. I'm a Hensley, I told her. We don't dull. We just get more dangerous. The silence after the call felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a hunter in a blind. The basement of the house on Ashford Street always smelled of damp earth, cedar, and the faint trace of lavender my late wife Eleanor used to keep in muslin sachets. I hadn't spent much time down there since she passed 8 years earlier. I went down on a Tuesday, ostensibly checking a leak in the pipes, but really searching for something else. I needed to know if the woman who'd stood beside me through 31 years of Atlantic winters would approve of the blockade. I was building against our only son. In the corner sat her steamer trunk, dark wood with brass fittings gone dull with time. I sat on a milk crate and opened it. Inside, beneath old baby blankets, was a small metal lockbox. I didn't need a key. Eleanor always used the same combination, the date of our first anniversary. Inside was a thick envelope addressed to me in her elegant, sloping handwriting postmarked 3 weeks before she died. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Dear Walter, it began. If you're reading this, the shadows have grown too long. This concerns Marcus. She wrote that she'd watched him for years, seen the way he looked at my success not with pride but with a ledger in his eyes. She'd caught him twice trying to access my private accounts, and though he claimed he was helping, his eyes were full of a frantic greed that scared her. She hadn't told me then, not wanting to add weight to my shoulders while I was still carrying the harbor. In this box you'll find a small savings passbook, she wrote. It isn't a fortune, but it's a shield. Use it if he ever corners you. Use it to stay free. Beneath the letter was a stack of bills and a passbook showing nearly $40,000. Eleanor hadn't just left me memories. She'd left me a manifest for survival, and she'd seen Marcus's trajectory long before that folder ever touched our dinner table. Grief hit me sharper than it had in years, but as it receded, it left behind something harder, something permanent. I tucked the letter into my breast pocket against my heart and climbed the stairs. Marcus thought he was the only one with secrets. He didn't know. I now had an ally who'd understood his weaknesses before he understood them himself. I hear you, Eleanor, I whispered in the kitchen. The manifest is clear, and I'm going to make sure our name still stands for something when the tide comes in. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 on a Saturday. I adjusted my cardigan to look slightly disheveled and let out a long, shaky breath before opening the door. Marcus and Vanessa stood there with a basket of muffins and expressions of exaggerated concern. Hi, Dad, Marcus said, voice dropping into that patronizing register. You sounded a bit off on the phone. Did I? I blinked slowly, letting my gaze wander as if struggling to focus. They followed me into the kitchen, and while Marcus talked about the heating bill, I watched Vanessa in the reflection of the toaster. She moved to the counter where I kept my pill organizer, and with a quick motion, swept the bottle into her pocket. Walter, dear, did you take your afternoon dose? I don't see the bottle, she said, turning with a predatory smile. I patted my pockets, feigning panic. It was right there. I can't remember. This is what we've been talking about, Vanessa said. It's the second time this week. Marcus placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Even the kids noticed, Dad. Owen was upset you forgot his soccer team's name. He's playing for the Seahawks, I offered. He plays for the Thunder, Dad. That's baseball versus soccer. You knew that a month ago. What they didn't know was that the decorative smoke detector I'd installed the week before was actually a hidden camera streaming everything to an encrypted server. I watched Vanessa slip into the hallway and tuck my medication into the umbrella stand, planting evidence for later. When they finally left, I watched from the window as Vanessa leaned toward Marcus in the car, laughing at how easy it had all been. That night my phone buzzed at 11:45 with a message from an unknown number. Meet at the grocery lot, come alone. I found Vanessa there, mascara smudged, hands shaking. Marcus isn't taking us to Lewiston with you, she said, voice cracking. He's got a flight booked to Panama. 1 ticket, not 4. She handed me a heavy envelope. His betting ledgers, forged power of attorney drafts, contact information for the men he owed. Protect the kids in the trust, and I'll give you the head of the man trying to destroy you, she said. The enemy of my enemy, I muttered and took the envelope. 4 weeks after that first dinner, the house on Ashford Street smelled of slow-cooked stew, the same recipe Eleanor used to make. Marcus and Vanessa arrived at 6:30, Marcus frantic and bloodshot, clearly feeling the pressure of men far less patient than I was. Partway through dinner, I let my fork slip and clatter against the china, staring blankly at the wall. Marcus seized the moment, sliding the guardianship folder across the table with a trembling hand. Dad, we need to sign this now. I didn't reach for the pen. I pushed my plate aside, sat up straight, and let the confusion fall away. The Thunder play soccer, Marcus. I've always known that. I placed a heavy black folder on top of his papers, the finalized trust, my medical certification, and the evidence of his debts. I'm still the master of this port, I said. Marcus's head snapped toward Vanessa, searching for loyalty he no longer had. I laid out his options: sign a full renunciation and confession, and the trust would quietly settle his most dangerous debt, or I'd call the police that night. His hand shook so violently the pen clattered against the china, but he signed every page. Get out, I said, and he walked out a broken man. Margaret Cole arrived minutes later with a notary to make it all official under oath, the deed transferring fully into the Hensley Family Legacy Trust. Hours later, Marcus returned, drunk and pounding on the door, screaming for money he no longer had a claim to. I stepped onto the porch with my cane, calm as a mountain, and told him plainly that he'd been erased from the manifest. A patrol car arrived, guided quietly by Gerald's godson, and took him away for violating the restraining order Margaret had already filed. The next morning I scrubbed the muddy porch clean, bagged up every trace of him left in the house, and set it by the curb. Within days, Nora arrived from Denver with Owen and Clara, and the house filled with noise again, the good kind. I taught Owen how to tie a bowline at the kitchen table, the knot that never slips but always unties when it's time. Weeks later, I sat with Gerald on the pier, handing him the charter for a new scholarship fund in Eleanor's name, built for the children of dock workers who needed a fair wind to get moving. We're just on the next watch, Walter, Gerald said, watching the ships come in. Watching the horizon so the kids can sleep soundly. By spring, I stood in my garden again, planting heirloom tomatoes, my hands steady, my mind entirely my own. The manifest of Walter Hensley was open to a new page, and for the first time in years, I wasn't just managing the cargo, I was enjoying the view. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. If it moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And be sure to check out more stories like this one right here on the Revenge Hub.